This week we are looking at attitudes and values, and we are going to specifically look at exploring racism. We're going to explore prejudice, ethnocentrism, stereotypes, equity, and equality. And our focus is really in understanding how personal attitudes and institutional systems shape equity in education. So our learning objectives for this lesson are we have 4 of them. We're going to define and differentiate key concepts, identify examples in educational settings, reflect on our personal attitudes and systemic structures, and then apply concepts to analyze real-world school scenarios. And why it matters in education. So I know not everyone in this course is doing education, but I do want to touch briefly on that since this is geared more towards educators. So teachers' values and beliefs influence our expectations. Also, in a workplace setting, your boss and your expectations are going to shape your values and beliefs, right? So they might not be aligned. Also, institutions, and we're talking about education institutions, shape access and outcomes, and cultural awareness builds inclusive learning environments. And this can be true for, like, we can talk about inclusive work environments and inclusive, like, kind of every environment that you put yourself into. So this can go beyond education as well. Our key concepts and definitions. So these are things that we really need to know what they mean when we're talking throughout this lesson. So I have this chart for you here. So let's look at individual racism. Those are your personal beliefs, attitudes, or actions that perpetuate racial bias. We'll get more into this, more detail in just a minute on all of these. Institutional racism, those are policies or practices within institutions that systematically disadvantage certain groups. Prejudice, preconceived judgment or opinion not based on reason or actual experience. Ethnocentrism, belief that one's culture is the norm or superior to others. Stereotypes, oversimplified generalizations about a group. Sociotypes, culturally shared perceptions of social groups that may be partly accurate but can still lead to some bias. Equality, giving everyone the same resources or opportunities. And equity, providing resources based on individual needs to ensure fair outcomes. So let's look at individual racism, and that refers to your personal beliefs, attitudes, or actions that reflect prejudice or bias against someone based on their race or ethnicity. This occurs when a person's words or behaviors express discriminatory assumptions, stereotypes, or hostility towards individuals of another racial group. I'm sure you've all seen, like, racism. Hopefully you have not been a victim of racism, but this does happen a lot. And some key characteristics of individual racism is that it's personal, but it's also interpersonal. It's rooted in an individual's worldview, their upbringing, or their personal experiences. It can be conscious, so explicit, such as using racial slurs or refusing to hire someone because of their race. It can also be implicit or unconscious when people act on stereotypes or internalized biases without realizing it. This is a lot of times often expressed through microaggressions. Those are subtle insults or dismissive behaviors that communicate inferiority. So some examples of this being used in education would be like a teacher assuming that an African American or Latino student needs extra discipline, but interpreting the same behavior as energetic when a white student does the exact same thing. Another example could be like a counselor steering students of color away from AP or advanced placement courses, because it might be too hard for them. And like real world application example could be like a landlord refusing to rent to someone based on their race, right? So a white landlord is not going to rent to someone that is Black or Latino. On the flip side of that, you have institutional racism, and that is sometimes called systemic racism, and it refers to policies, practices, and structures within organizations and institutions that produce and maintain racial inequality, even if no individual intends harm. So it's embedded in the systems that govern like education, law, healthcare, employment, and housing. Some key characteristics of institutional racism: they are systemic and structural, so it's not personal, operates through rules, procedures, traditions, or distributions that appear neutral but really have racially unequal effects. And it's sustained by power and authority. Those who design or enforce policies may not see their impact as discriminatory, right? It's measured through outcomes and patterns. So who is suspended more often? Who has access to advanced courses? Who gets promoted? So some examples of institutional racism: a school discipline policy that suspends Black and Native American students for subjective behaviors like disrespect or defiance, but they don't do that to white students. This is a really important one. This is probably one that is talked about and that you can see: curriculum that centers white Euro-American perspectives while marginalizing Indigenous, African American, or Latinx histories. Standardized testing practices that advantage students with access to certain cultural or linguistic capital, right? The words that I'm using in today's lesson, have you noticed? They're not words that we hear a lot. This is an example of institutional racism. I'm not using jargon or words that you guys hear every day, right? And that is I'm doing it on purpose to kind of drive this point home that sometimes we don't even realize that we're doing it in certain settings, and certain people don't realize that they're doing it until they're told that it's happening, that it's occurring, that you are doing it, right? Think about like zoning and funding systems that lead to white schools having newer facilities, more experienced teachers. Everyone gets a new Chromebook. Everyone gets a new iPad. Everyone gets a new like MacBook, compared to schools that don't have those resources. So impact-wise in education, institutional racism, it often reproduces inequality even without overt prejudice. So for example, when discipline data show that students of color are punished more severely than white peers for the same actions, the issue doesn't really lie in a teacher's bias, but in how the institutional culture and policy defines acceptable behavior. How does the school define acceptable behavior? Institutional racism, it's a lot harder to see and it's harder to change because most of the time it looks like business as usual. Okay, I want us to now look at prejudice and ethnocentrism. So prejudice refers to preconceived opinions or attitudes. Most of the time this is negative opinions or attitudes about individuals or groups, and it's really formed without any sort of direct knowledge, evidence, or experience. And it involves judging someone based on group membership. So group membership being like race, ethnicity, religion, gender, like what language they speak, rather than personal qualities or behavior. So the term comes from pre-judgment, and when we prejudge someone, that means we have judged them, we've formed opinions before any facts are known. Some key characteristics of this can be, it's really attitudinal rather than behavioral, so it exists in the mind as a belief or an assumption. Prejudice, it can be conscious or unconscious, like some prejudice are openly expressed and others are implicit or unexamined. It's often learned through socialization, so like your family, through peers, through media, and institutions shape ideas about who is normal, smart, lazy, or dangerous. And again, I just want to reiterate, this can be positive or negative, though both distort reality and limit genuine understanding. Prejudice in education, it really affects how teachers perceive and interpret and respond to students' behavior and even their potential. So even well-intentioned educators, we carry bias, and that does influence our expectations and our interactions with students. So an example of this would be like a teacher assuming that an English language learner is less intelligent rather than recognizing the language difference. So just because you can't speak English, a teacher might think, well, that person's dumb. That person could speak 4 languages. One of those 4 just doesn't happen to be English. That doesn't mean that the person's stupid, right? That means that actually they're like very intelligent if they can speak 4 different languages. Or another one would be believing that all Asian American students are always high achieving and therefore they don't need as much academic support. Ethnocentrism, like this is the one that my culture is normal. So the definition kind of is the tendency to view one's own cultural norms, values, and practices as superior, while viewing other cultures as strange, less developed, or inferior. It is a natural human inclination, but when examined, it becomes a major barrier to multicultural education. And some key characteristics of this centers one, culture as the standard of correctness or intelligence. It leads to judging others' behaviors, their communication styles, or their beliefs through your own cultural lens. It can be institutionalized when schools' rules, curriculum, and communication norms are based primarily on the dominant cultural values, and it's often invisible to those who benefit from it. You might have heard of white privilege. White privilege is invisible to whites. We don't know, we can't see it because we benefit from it. So you talk about white privilege to a white person, they're like, that's not real, that doesn't exist. And it's like, well, it does, but you benefit from it, so you don't see it. So schools are cultural institutions that reflect the values of societies that build them, right? So when one culture perspective dominates, and in the US, that's usually a Euro-American or like Anglo-American, white American, middle-class norms, students from other backgrounds can really feel marginalized or even misjudged. Just some more examples than what I have here from you, like curriculum centered primarily on Western civilization, while Indigenous African or Latin American histories are treated as add-ons. They're not center of the story. They're like extra things that we pull in and talk about. Expecting all students to communicate in direct assertive styles, while penalizing students from collectivist or high context cultures that we talked about last week, who may communicate more indirectly or just differentially. School policies that define professionalism or appropriate behavior in ways that reflect one culture, right? So you'll see this sometimes even in businesses. One example of this is like hairstyles. Some African American men and women, but women in particular, are not allowed to wear their hair in dreads or in box braids because it's like that's not your natural hairstyle. Okay. So what is natural hairstyle? And it's whites are making these rules that are supposed to apply to everyone else, but those rules can't always apply, right? It doesn't make sense because they don't apply to everyone. So even like expressions of respect, and that's going to be really important when you do your case study for this week. But, a lot of times teachers misunderstanding cultural differences as misbehavior, such as interpreting, lack of eye contact as defiance instead of it's really showing you respect by me not looking you in the eyes. We're going to move on to stereotypes versus sociotypes. The stereotype is a generalized belief or fixed idea about the characteristics, attributes, or behaviors of all members of a particular group. So in essence, stereotyping is a form of mental shorthand. People use it to make sense of a social complexity. Key features or key characteristics of this is overgeneralization, assumes everyone in the group shares the same traits. It is emotionally charged often, resistant to change. Once formed, stereotypes are maintained even when contradictory evidence appears. And also it is linked to power. Dominant group stereotypes about others often justify unequal treatment or status. And stereotypes can subtly shape teachers' expectations in school and school policies. So there's also like a lot of different stereotypes within school settings. So you can have racial and ethnic stereotypes, and examples of that are like Black boys are aggressive, Latinx students struggle academically, gender stereotypes, boys are better at STEM, girls are better at language arts, socioeconomic stereotypes, low-income parents don't value education, linguistic stereotypes, like students who speak with an accent are less intelligent. And then let's break that down and talk about sociotypes, like kind of offshoot of that. A sociotype is a generalization about a group that has some bias in social reality or collective experience. So it differs in that it is evidence-based and descriptive, and it's not always judgmental. So, in education, sociotypes help educators understand cultural differences and adapt instruction accordingly, but you do have to be flexible and respectful when looking at this. So stay tuned. This is just like the first half of this lesson. There is a second video, and we're going to dive more into equality and equity and kind of wrap up and kind of look at how all of these affect each other.